Freedom from the law, but where does tithing fit in? You know, money, one of the most controversial Christian topics there is. Have you heard about this 3-month tithing challenge that is so popular in lots of churches today? They say, we know it hurts to give, but if you'll give 10%, then we promise that God is going to show up and bless you. And then they quote from a passage in Malachi, and they quote about all the blessings you can experience. But they leave out half of the passage. They leave out the part about the cursing, because it's not exactly ecclesiastically correct to tell people they're going to be cursed if they don't give a tithe. And whoever said that we can put a time limit on God of 3 months and then expect Him to show up on the scene and rescue everything? Is that the motivation to give, that God is going to give in return? Is God like a divine slot machine? Does He operate no different than a mindless machine? Maybe there's more to this tithing thing than we realize. You know, the root of tithing, it actually comes from the Old Testament law. The Israelites were to fund the Levitical priesthood by giving 10% and then some. And then there were grain offerings and all kinds of offerings that actually added up to much more than 10%. But today, here we are on this side of the cross as New Testament Christians, and we're pushing the 10%. Is that what God would have us do? Does He want us to be motivated to give an exact amount so that we can measure ourselves and decide whether we're giving enough? Is that what this New Testament life is for? Well, I know what some people will say. They'll say that, no, wait, the root of tithing is before the law. You remember when Abraham tithed to Melchizedek, and they'll go back and they'll find an Old Testament example where someone gave 10%, but here's the whole story on that. Abraham, he gave 10% of his spoils of war. Yeah, that means he went and killed everybody, and then he took their stuff. Now, is that the example we're supposed to follow today? To go war against people groups and take their stuff and then dump 10% of it on the church lawn? Of course not. You know, the fact is that in the Middle East, that was a very common practice. For someone to go to war and then give 10% of their spoils of war to someone that they respect, to someone of royalty, to someone who was greater than them. And that's why the book of Hebrews retells that story. It retells the story of Abraham tithing to Melchizedek to show that Abraham respected a priest, a mystery man who was a symbol, a shadow, a picture of Jesus Christ. And the whole point is that Levi wasn't even around. And so we have a priest in Jesus that came before the law, a priest in Jesus that came independent of the law, and that's the whole point. A priest that even Abraham, the forefather of the Jews, was willing to respect. So it's not about emulating the works of Abraham. You know, Abraham, he only gave that 10% one time. That would mean that we would go to war and give our 10% once in a lifetime? No, the New Testament model is very clear. It says, give freely, from the heart, not under pressure. You know what I've found? I've found that people that grow up with a 10% mandate in their life, they end up not giving at all many times because they feel like if it's not 10%, then it doesn't count. It just doesn't stack up. Is that what God wants us thinking? That if it's any less than 10%, then it's no good to Him? You know, God is looking at our hearts. He's not asking us to measure ourselves by the Jewish law. In fact, most of us who are engaged in this tithing debate today, we're Gentiles. We look down at ourselves, we look at our bloodline, our heritage. We're not Jews. We were never invited to the law. And here we are picking and grasping at straws from the law in order to try to motivate people. What if we church leaders, what if we just relied on what the New Testament explains, that God's going to work in our hearts and that giving is even a spiritual gift and that it comes from a heart that is grateful and thankful for the gospel? And what if God's way esteems any gift? That if we give 1% or 8% or 12%, that God's looking at the heart and He makes any gift of value if it comes from Him. Maybe that's what freedom is all about. With freedom comes choice. With freedom comes responsibility. No, we shouldn't sit on our hands when it's time to give. If we see a need and we have a passion for that ministry, give toward it. Paul tells us to give according to what we have, not according to what we don't have. While some people say give until it hurts, Paul says the opposite. He says to give out of our abundance. When other people have need and we have abundance, that's when we should give. And it should come from the heart, not under pressure. Now that's God without religion.